Hello, welcome back. We have our good friend Kurt Bergland to talk about something that most of you know that I enjoy, and that is Negro League Baseball and the options that we have in our community, especially cards and dice, but maybe even into the computer realm a little bit. So we have Kurt to talk about that. Thanks for being here, Kurt.
Well, thank you, my friend. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Um, so I think a good place to start would be is maybe talking about the challenges with trying to create a baseball sim for Negro League baseball. I thought that might be a good place to start. Um, so, you got any thoughts on that? I know that's kind of a broad, a broad jump, but
Yeah. Um, yes, I do actually. The first of all, the good news about the Negro Leagues, I think, is that there is a lot of qualitative data. There are a lot of firsthand accounts. There's a lot of really good historical descriptions of how baseball was played, who was good, who wasn't, which teams were important, which weren't, why some teams succeeded and some didn't, why some cities were better than others. And so that, like, from that standpoint, and I'm thinking now about James Riley's biographical encyclopedia of the Negro Leagues.
mhm.
He stood on the shoulders of a lot of people, but he also did a lot of his own research um, to create just an incredible document. And if you don't have that book and you're interested in the Negro Leagues, that's really the place that I started, and I think is a wonderful place to start. If you read that book, um, and you read others by people like Larry Lester, for example, you get the idea that Negro Leagues baseball history is much like um, the history of professional baseball in the white leagues, and that is that every decade was sort of different.
Mhm.
And so it's difficult to, in my brain, to sort of paint with a broad brush about what the Negro Leagues were like without really narrowing down to a more specific time period. And so when I think the casual fan thinks that the Negro Leagues were like dead ball baseball except with power. And I think while at certain segments of Negro Leagues baseball history, that's true. I also think that that's a little too general and that every decade had its own sort of flavor. And that's a challenge to put together a set of cards or certainly a sim that's going to accurately give a picture of um, what the game was like in those eras in those parks. The Negro Leagues are very much park bound,
Mhm.
huge ballpark effects in those leagues, and um, as the American and National Leagues were bound by whether the ball was dead or not, how much travel was taking place and when, who the opponents were going to be, and the quality of the opposition. So all of those are very complicating factors in creating a set of cards or a sim that are going to reflect the Negro Leagues. The other thing, the good news, the other piece of good news is that the data picture is becoming clearer and clearer. And over the last, well, certainly 25 years or so, um, but especially in the last couple of decades, more and better research has been done. And we've got a much clearer picture of what it was that these leagues were like, what the players were like, what the teams were like, than we did before, when all there was before really was some quantitative data, but most of it was qualitative and anecdotal and some firsthand accounts. And gets tough to work with. But now the picture is much clearer, and it's getting clearer all the time. So there's a lot of it's a really important era in baseball. It's a really important um, set of leagues and teams and players to know about. But the good news is that we're knowing more all the time, and I think that we're getting to the point where we can make some pretty concrete assertions about the quality of the game and the players. And I think that's really exciting. This is a great time to be a fan of the Negro Leagues, or to be entering you're learning about the Negro Leagues, because there's so much information that's available to us.
Yeah, there's no doubt the improvements have been huge. The interest is off the charts. So that as a result, those who are investigating, and researching, I know, like is it ASBR?
Yeah.
I know that I've got a few books of theirs, their research, where they are digging and, finding things. So a few questions based on what you just said. Number one, would you say that the parallels, you talk about the decades and the time frames, would you find that the parallels, in your opinion, match the major league parallels? For example, would you say that the 1910s and the aughts would compare pretty much to Negro League at the time? The 30s, in Major League would be comparable to the 30 in the Negro Leagues. And I know that there's more variables than that, but would you find that there's a parallel, like the 30s is very offensive heavy, dead ball, not many home runs. So in your experience, would you say that that's kind of similar in the Negro Leagues?
Yes. Except I would say that in my mind, they're parallel until about 1920. And then there's this divergence
Okay.
where increasingly, not immediately, but increasingly, the American and National Leagues leave behind some of the aggressive play of the dead ball era and
Mm,
rely increasingly more on power.
right.
And whereas the Negro Leagues really never, and you can look at the stolen base totals just
Mhm.
as evidence of this. The Negro Leagues never really abandoned a very aggressive type of play, and so whether it's stealing bases or bunting or the hit and run or the run and hit, putting pressure on the defense never really stopped being a thing for the Negro Leagues. Whereas the American and National Leagues by the 30s really aren't engaged in that very much, or at least not in a way that was comparable to what was going on in the dead ball era. And so by the time the 30s happen, you have a very different uh, style of play for the two systems. I think is a better way of putting it, probably. And so, like, I think of 1930s baseball in the Negro Leagues as being very comparable to like a 1980s baseball in the American and National League, because speed and defense and pitching was just as important as waiting for a bomb. And I think I would generalize that the best pitching in the Negro Leagues was better than the best pitching in the American and National Leagues. And so um, it's like the 80s in that way as well. Walk totals weren't quite as high, whips were a little bit lower. And if you generalize across the leagues, they're pretty close. But if you look at the best of the best, the better pitchers were in the Negro Leagues in the 30s. And I think a much more compelling brand of baseball was going on in the Negro
Mhm.
Leagues in the 30s. I think that decade was the best Negro Leagues decade for my money, because you had um, the game was the most popular. The war wasn't interrupting things, and I think the quality of play was the most interesting and the highest level. So
Yeah,
up until the end of the dead ball period, I'd go with that with similarity. But then there's this divergence, and the games got very different.
I think that to your point, you kind of saw that once the major leagues were integrated. Once
Right.
enough of those player type players, they changed the game. Even the late '60s is a lot different than the '50s. Um, you know, and so
Right.
to your point, they kind of changed the game to that style. Like you said, up into the '80s. But so I think that is a very good point. That if you like that style of baseball, it was definitely, much more so, like you said, than waiting for the 3-run homer, which you kind of got from the '30s on in
Well,
Major
yeah,
League Baseball.
difference in approach to pitching that I think is really important that's missed too. Like in the Negro Leagues, in the major leagues in the 30s and really in the 40s and even into the 50s, like if a pitcher walked a batter, who cared? I mean, big deal. I mean, pitching around people and not being aggressive as a pitcher was pretty much accepted practice. The ballparks were small and you did not want to give anybody anything good to hit. That was conventional wisdom. But if you look at Negro Leagues pitching, that wasn't going on. They were challenging the hitters much more. And so it's the offense that's different, but it's also like how you get people out, how you go about approach, the whole approach to the game, that aggressiveness piece is just so different. Um, yeah, it's a different. It's both ends of the game. It's the offense and it's the defense, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Hmm. Yeah. So you also said that there's no doubt the stats have improved immensely, but you said a lot of it is anecdotal. Reading about the people who could do certain things. So even though the stats are definitely improved, would you say that in order to create a good baseball sim, that you probably would need to delve a little deeper than just the stats to get a good representation of what was going on?
Well, when I did the Negro League sets that I did for Pine Tar, and I did those about um wow, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I I certainly looked at the quantitative data, but I was also trying to read as much as I could
Hmm.
about what people were saying. Now there were what that does is it creates a little bit of a problem because you get sometimes some conflicts between what the numbers tell you and
Hmm.
what the firsthand accounts are telling you. Um, but who cares? You still know more than you did before you started.
Hmm.
And if there's some inconsistency there, that didn't especially bother me. I wanted to kind of immerse myself in as much as I could know before I started the process of creating the cards. And I think that that's really the only way to do it. I can't imagine saying to yourself, well, I'm going to stick to the numbers because that's really and exclusively stick to
Hmm.
the numbers because that's all we can really be sure of. And I just don't, I think a broader approach is the best way to go.
Yeah, yeah, but then you also had the issues. I think because of the nature of what the Negro Leagues were trying to accomplish. I mean, and I've read this from like the SABR people. That they would exaggerate sometimes.
Sure.
To try to draw a crowd. Because they're obviously trying to live and make a living, and so some of the anecdotal. Is and that's a kind of the people who are doing the research for them. That's one thing that they are. I know one big example was Cristobal Torriente. Apparently there wasn't a lot known about him, and so one particular article I read was that there was some pretty big exaggerations, and so they were trying to weed through the stats and the anecdotes and the oral histories, to try to get a good representation. I mean, and the man was obviously a great baseball player, but you did have that aspect that there was some exaggerating, again, just to try to build ticket sales, build interest. So that's.
Absolutely. I mean, another example of that to me is Cool Papa Bell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but um, yeah, I just think, and maybe this is like my historian background, but like I just think that the more information you can have, even if it's not consistent, the better your representation, in this case of a sim, trying to help people understand what an era in baseball was like, the better. Now, that's especially true. It was especially true for me when it came to understanding a player's defensive capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
But it's true in the offensive part too, because you had ballparks that were, some were huge, some were tiny. And so you gotta make sense of that too. And so but the defense is the hardest part, to me, and was the hardest part when I was creating cards and sets but yeah, the more, to me, the more information the better.
Yeah, that's why one reason I was excited to talk to you about this is because I knew that you had some experience in creating cards, and so again, I really appreciate you doing this because and that kind of goes to another point, is the interest in the community for this.
Mm.
I know when I do videos, the interest isn't quite as high with the Negro Leagues as it is with some other stuff that I do. Have you found that in your experience when you do Negro League things? Do you find, and again, that's not a good or a bad thing, it's just an observation.
Yeah, but I never really know why. Is it because of the sim that I'm using? Is it because of the day of the week the video is on? Is it because it is the Negro Leagues? I haven't really figured out a pattern. I do think people are interested. I think that there is definitely a market for
Hmm.
sims to be produced that are done well, and I think they sell,
Hmm.
which to me says there's interest. But
So did the
it's
Pine Tar
hard.
sell well?
What's that?
Did your Pine Tar Negro League sets, did they sell well?
Yeah, they
Okay.
did. They do. And I mean, you're it's a thing where if you create a set for a season, there's immediate interest and immediate purchase. But what I found with the Negro League sets were that there's release, and then there's some purchases, and then there's buzz, and then come the second wave that's bigger.
Okay.
So it's different, but it's popular, and it's really gratifying because I didn't know if there was going to be any interest in what I was doing or not. And but there's definitely a market out there for good stuff to be produced.
Yeah, I mean, and that's obvious, and because most Sims do it,
Right.
Strat's got a big investment in Negro League. Obviously, Atbas does it. Pine Tar Replay has the 1923 season, which is very good in my opinion.
Mhm.
And Action PC, they have some offerings. So obviously, there's interest in it.
Yeah, I think the set that Scott Simkus created for Stratomatic paved the way for everything else. I
Now,
mean,
which set was that? Was that the All Stars?
yeah, that was the
Okay.
100 what was that, 108, 104, 108 cards, and they were on glossy stock, and he wrote
Oh
a
yeah,
book to go with it
yeah.
that was really, to me, groundbreaking for the hobby.
Hmm.
And that set, I think, because of the popularity of that set, it showed other uh, designers, other producers, that there's a market if it's done well. So I think a huge debt in the hobby is owed to Scott Simkus for what he did, and that in some respects, like all of the sets that follow owe a debt to him
Mhm.
for that.
So, so I guess that would be a good place to jump into the different kind of options that are available. So you got your all-star type sets.
Right?
You've got players included in like Hall of Fame sets. You know
Mhm.
the how many is there? What, roughly 30 Negro League players in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, I think it's 32, something like that. It's a little difficult, uh, because some people aren't in as players.
Okay,
But I think it's 32 players. It's right around 30.
so that
There,
give you
and you could make a really, really strong, in my mind, you can make a really, really strong case for probably 20 more, and then you get another 20 that are kind of, I guess, borderline. But they cut the list off to me too early, and so they miss some people that should be in clearly.
so in a
But
Hall of Fame set you'd get a small sampling size. Um,
right, so like Appa's Hall of Fame set had, uh, or has, those players, and then I want to, I can think of another maybe five or so that they included that weren't in yet.
okay.
But and in the Appa set, there's not only the Hall of Famers, but there are some near misses, and they
Mm.
sort of make some predictions about who might be coming soon. And so, and there's a few extra additional Negro Leaguers in there as well. Um,
So
it doesn't go hog wild on it, but there's a few extras. I
little bit
know.
like History Maker, their Hall of
Um,
Fame set.
yes, yes. Like for example, Appa had a Buck O'Neill card in their set before Buck O'Neill was in the Hall of Fame. So now you could argue whether Buck O'Neill was in the hall, it was inducted as a player or not,
Right.
or to what extent his playing career helped his candidacy. Um, but leaving that to the side, he was a player. He is in the set. So
Mhm. So you got Hall of Fame sets. You got great teams like the Strat's Diamond Gems. Atba has a great team set. Actually, I think Strat has two, A and B. Uh, and so you got those kind of things where they go back and actually card real teams.
right,
So you can do that. Um, there are some seasons, not many. That's where again that's my wheelhouse. Those are the kind of things I enjoy, and so the offerings for those are a bit weaker at this point. I feel it's improving and getting better. But because I am such a fan of Negro Leagues, I have all of these things, or most of them. I don't have any Hall of Fame sets, but I got both of the Diamond Gems. I got Atba's offering. Um, so again, yeah, I got the All Stars. Now I got the current printing of the Strat All Star. It's just on regular. They don't have the special cards, and there wasn't a book or anything. There is a book with the Diamond Gems, but um, so I know like Replay Baseball, they did 1923, which was a good year. Now, are you familiar with Strat PC's Negro League offerings?
I know they've offered a bunch of seasons,
Hmm.
but I haven't used it, the seasons on the PC yet. No.
Okay. So basically, because I'd like your opinion on this because it's interesting to me, and so somebody who likes seasons, this is kind of an interesting approach. So basically, what they've done is they prorated the seasons to 154 games, and so obviously they're taking some liberties there because some of these teams had very small sample sizes,
Sure.
so I imagine they're going. the year before, the year after their career, kind of where they were at in that point, but they are prorating it to 154. They also, like for example, I'm doing 1920, which I got from Chris White, which we'll talk about in a minute. But their 1920, there was the Negro National League, and then you had quite a few Eastern Independent teams. So what they
Right.
did is they took the 8 Negro National League, they took 2 of the Eastern Independents, and then they took players from the other independent clubs and put them on one of the 10 teams. If that makes sense. So, like for example, there was a Eastern colored or Eastern Cuban Stars. I'm sorry, Cuban Stars who they put their main players on the Cuban Western Stars, which was part of the Negro National League. I know, like the Lincoln, the New York Lincoln Giants.
Sure.
They put them on the Brooklyn Royal Giants. So that's kind of what they did. So you got a 10 team league, and then they put most people with the teams they played for, but a few that were on the other teams that didn't play much, they put those on the other teams to kind of get. What are your thoughts on that? Obviously, you're taking some liberties, but so far I've been pretty impressed with what they did. It again, you can argue some of their decisions, but it gives you a much more solid season, if that makes any sense.
Hmm. Well, I think it depends upon what your goal is. I mean, if the goal is to really understand what the leagues were like as leagues individually, then you can't do that. It is sort of it mixes too much, and it gives a misleading impression of what the baseball was like at that time.
Mhm.
But if the goal is to learn about the players that were major players at that time and about a little bit about what they could do, especially relative to each other, then I don't have a problem with it. You just have to kind of decide what it is that you're trying to do. Um, the quality, as you know, between the leagues varied a lot,
Mhm.
and so hitting 300 in one league would not be the same as hitting 300 in another league. And so when you start mixing, it gets a little bit misleading. I know that when I was creating franchise all-star teams for Pine Tar, and I looked at the data between, like, the Chicago American Giants are a good example because they had a team with um, uh, incredible offensive might right around 1909, 1910, 1911. And then in I want to say 17, they won another championship. The players are the same for the most part. Roster was very similar, but the batting stats had fallen off the table, and they were doing it all with pitching. And so when I'm trying to create a franchise all-star team, I'm looking at these numbers and trying to figure out what in the world happened and what's the real ability of these players.
Mhm.
And I think that that's the question that you'd have to run into if you were going to be combining players and teams. But I mean, fun, absolutely. Do you get a glimpse as to what the player could do? Absolutely. Do you get all the big names in the set? You sure do, because you can design it as you want to. You don't have those sort of hindrances to what you're doing. I mean, the other thing that I would say is that what you can avoid with that is, like, a lot of times on a Negro Leagues team, especially one that was kind of mediocre, you'd have a very strong top of the batting order, and the bottom of the batting order would just fall off. I mean, you'd have guys hitting 200,
Mhm.
150. And so, and if you do too much tweaking, you lose that. That's what the game was like. And so, um, Yeah, I guess it just all comes down to what your goal is. But I think it could work. It could be very interesting.
Yeah. So um, what I'm doing is Chris White, who you have mentioned on your channel.
Absolutely.
He creates all kinds of cards that are APA compatible, but
Right.
he offers seasons,
Mhm.
which nobody else does. And
Right.
so I got his 1920 Negro National League, so that was 8 teams, and then I had him print 2 teams, the two Eastern Independent teams that played the most. So basically, I followed Strat's teams. What I didn't do is I didn't take players from the other Eastern Independent teams who didn't play much,
Hmm.
and there was some good players on those teams. So unfortunately, my 1920 experience is not going to involve them. But out of those 10 teams, it involves a lot. And so what I'm doing now, Chris, he built his cards off of the stats that are, and so as a result, you might have somebody who pitched 3 games and had a one ERA. So what I'm doing is kind of, and most people probably, again, unless you just really love this kind of stuff, probably wouldn't take this much effort. If you want to plug and play, so to speak, you're probably going to be frustrated if you want to try to do Negro League stuff because it isn't as cut and dry, as getting 1921 major leagues. Again, just because the nature of the beast is just different.
Right.
But so I'm using Strats prorated a little bit. I'm leaning more heavy to what they did in real life. So I'm playing probably about a 70 game season with those 10 teams, um, and enjoying it very much, but making a few tweaks. Now, obviously, I can't change the batter cards because he's already computed those. So again, so it's not a perfect, but there really isn't a perfect. Again,
Right.
because of all the variables we talked about. So and I've said this before, and something that you said has really hit home with me. The two of the major things that you look for in a sim is it fun, and am I learning something? And so I've kind of, after I've thought about that quite a bit, I've boiled that down to that's pretty much where I am. Those are the two things that I look for in a sim. And um, so even though it's not perfect, if you're the kind of person who, you have to know how many balks the fifth starter had, and make sure that he gets the same amount.
Right.
If the bases are loaded,
Right.
it's you're not gonna you're gonna struggle with this. So basically, you have to, at least I have to, I have to kind of look at the big picture and accept some things. But again, I especially doing 1920, what the biggest fun of this is that I'm really learning the players. Like for example, like you said, you've got in 1920, that was the first year of the Negro National League, which when they started making leagues, that really helped it start becoming apples and apples. Again, it wasn't there, but without, if Rube Foster hadn't started the leagues, I don't think we would have nearly what we have now as far as being able to play Sims. Because, like you said, even pre 1920, you've got, like you said, the Chicago American Giants who are crushing the ball, and then all of a sudden they stop. What's going on? Again, when you're playing independent, you're getting much more apples and oranges from the major leagues. But I'm learning a ton about, you've got usually 2 or 3 guys in the league that hit 350, 360, and then you've got 3 or 4 starters who played every day, who hit 150.
Right.
And so you could say there's different reasons for that, but it is what it is. And so that's part of the experience. So
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing that I really enjoy about uh, managing a team from the Negro Leagues is the smaller roster size and
Mhm.
managing around that, despite the fact that like my mental furniture is used to like the 25-man roster
Mhm.
and 10-man pitching staff, but to really adjust how you think about the game, and it it's it is it's different, but it's fun. It's definitely an intellectual challenge. It's wonderful. You got to dive in and just do it. Yeah.
And then you also got the players who played when they weren't pitching.
Mm,
You got a lot of that. You got the big guys like Double Duty Ratcliffe, but they was a lot of them.
yeah,
Who would play. Like you said, because of small roster size. So you got somebody who needs a day off. They're gonna put you in the outfield or third or wherever.
absolutely.
And so when you're trying to redo a season, you kind of have to keep an eye on, okay, who seam heads is just fantastic.
Yeah.
Seam heads is so good. I mean, again, I have it open, and it gives you their stats. It gives you what positions they played, and so I use that quite a bit, to help me to know who what pitchers played in the field.
Right.
And now I will say Strat does a pretty good job of that because they've got their manager thing set up. So I actually quite often can follow what Strat. If you set it on primary with rest,
Mm,
they'll interchange. Like Tank Carr, he played first base most of the time. Um, this last game I played, they put him in right field, and sure enough, he played right field some.
right.
And so that I'm finding that the Strat is a helpful tool with me doing this APA compatible set. And so again, enjoying it quite a bit. Um, so we're going back to the options you have. You got seasons now. One thing that always, again, generally speaking, I don't like cross era, whether it's Negro League or other, because of the things that you talked about, knowing how to, again, a guy in 1930 Major League is going to playing somebody from 1915. You're going to have some challenges there to try to figure out how these two are going to compete. You know what I mean? It's just not, you can't go just off of the stats because that's not going to work. Because 1930 teams were hitting 300, with tons of homers. You had a
Yeah.
lot more errors, in 1912. You had almost no home runs, and like you said, a lot more bunting, a lot more hitting and running. That's going to affect your stats. So that for me, that's always been a challenge. Um, so, but one thing that I've always wanted to do, and I haven't figured out exactly how to do it, is to try to integrate baseball before 1946. To
Mm,
me, that's something that's always grabbed my imagination. Like
mhm,
for example, take the 1924 Monarchs and put them in 1924 major leagues, for example.
right.
Or taking some Negro League stars and putting them on, one of the horrible Philadelphia athletic teams, and then
Sure.
see what they would do against the league, with, you know, Page or, Oscar Charleston or,
Yeah.
have you ever done anything like that? It's in
No, the closest I have, well, two things. One is that with the new Cooperstown set for History Maker baseball, um, I tried to make decade all-star teams,
Mhm,
and but there's four different subsets in the Cooperstown set that they have, and so it's not purely Hall of Famers, but
mhm,
um, you can't, and because I'm limited in creativity, I tried to create these decade all-star teams, but you can't really do it without integrating.
mhm,
So that's the first time that I've really done that, except for the 1938 replay set that just came out,
mm,
which includes the oh, I'm gonna get this wrong, but I think it's the Monarchs and the Grays.
mhm. Yeah, I
Um,
saw that on your video. That was a very interesting. I love those guys at Replay. They're always doing cool stuff.
yeah, I mean, what an interesting idea. And
Mhm,
so what I've been doing offline is just doing some barnstorming and running those two teams through the American and National League.
mhm,
You look on Delphi, there's people doing the same thing on the replay page on Delphi. And um, it's really interesting because those two teams are two of the ones, like, you can't, like you were saying before, you can't do it with a team that only played 20 games.
Hmm.
You've got to have a decent sample size of stats to be able to run it. But um, I'm really getting some interesting games. And at first, I wasn't sure if it would work or not, but I'm really having a good time with it. I think it's further testimony, even though I know that it's not apples and apples in terms of the competition that the teams were playing, but in a lot of cases it was better. I mean, the Philadelphia franchises by the end of the 30s, I think you got to use your imagination to really think that those guys were major leagues.
Right.
And uh so I think it's easy to sort of bash Negro Leagues competition. The internet guy really jumps on that.
Hmm.
But I think that there's a lot of fun to be had. So I'm doing it in two ways, I guess. One is I'm integrating with the individual players in the History Maker set, and I'm integrating with the individual teams in the replay set, and both are a lot of fun.
Yeah, doing obviously I would imagine Replay in their 38 set obviously designed these cards to do just that. So that at
Right.
least the designer of the set is thinking apples and apples here. So, the Diamond Gem, I did a lot of barnstorming with them as well. Like I would take the 24 Monarchs and play them against, the 24 Senators,
Oh, okay.
that kind of thing. And again, I'm imagining Strat designed these Diamond Gems for just that purpose,
Mm,
that you can take this Diamond Gem set and play it against other Diamond Gem sets. Now, especially if you're in the same time frame, I imagine you're going to get pretty good results. But like we've talked about from the beginning, it's there's probably going to be a little apples and oranges here, no matter what you do.
mm.
That's the tragedy of this whole thing, is that these guys never got a chance to play and see, on the big stage. And so that's kind of the nature of what we're dealing with.
Well, it is, but I mean, in a microcosm, aren't the 50s between the National League and the American League the same thing? The American League was so slow to integrate, and the National
Hmm.
League wasn't. And so there's no question but that really National League Baseball in the 50s was much better than American League Baseball, top to bottom. I mean, Yankees notwithstanding, um, the the races were better, the
Hmm.
teams were better, the quality of play was just better, and so it's not unprecedented for that to happen in in any comparison of leagues.
Hmm. Yeah, you're right. You're exactly right. I mean, if you could make that argument if you were doing kind of interleague play in 19, 41.
Oh, sure.
You could make the argument that, even though this was still the same time period, and, there are quite a similarity because they traded among each other, but still, that you could make the argument that there is some apples and oranges, even if you were, playing AL against NL.
Right. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
again, and part of what we do at this hobby is fantasy. Again, yeah, it's just a big part of it. And when I'm playing APBA, basic with my adjustments, there you have to at least I have to remember that I have to be in the fantasy, not in the game. You know what I mean?
Right.
You can think APBA or you can think fantasy. Again, a big example, you got a A pitcher who's getting shelled and you bring in a D pitcher in relief, well, why would you do that? That's stupid. But the fantasy is that's exactly what would happen, because number one, the manager didn't know this guy was going to be a D all year,
Right.
and oddly enough, the way the dice roll, quite often the D guy will come in and, close out the side.
That's true. That is so true. Just changes the vibe. It's, yeah, I can't even put my finger on it, but that's happened to me so many times. It's
Yeah.
not cool at all.
Yeah, me too. But again, I can't. For me, I can't enjoy it if I don't suspend the actual game and
Right.
play it like like I'm really these two teams are on a field of dreams somewhere playing this game. So that's the nature of this hobby. I don't care what you're looking at. It just I think it's a little bit more exaggerated, when you're dealing with this, but just again because of the way things transpired.
Mm. For sure. For sure.
Yeah, so those are some things that I would like to, again, I haven't figured out exactly how to do it yet, but again, taking a poor one of those Philadelphia teams, for example, and stocking it full, because I mean that would have been a hoot. Couldn't you imagine if that had happened in real life?
Oh, yeah.
If one of these teams just all of a sudden decided we're going to throw caution to the wind and fill up. They never would have done it, but it would have been really fun. I mean, Oscar Charleston, Cole Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, Satchel. I mean, if you'd have put all those guys on the, Philadelphia Phillies, I imagine they would have dominated.
Well, they would have drawn. That's the thing. I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
they could have made money doing it. I mean, I know that Commissioner Landis was clearly a blocking
Hmm.
influence on earlier integration than there was. But if you just look at what Bill Veeck did with Cleveland, I mean,
Hmm.
look at the leap forward he was able to take with the Indians franchise just by integrating.
Hmm.
Now he did other stuff too. He made some good trades. He
Hmm.
was a good evaluator of talent. But if that is an example of what could have been, then that also shows that these guys could have been making a lot more money than they did if they had just put or been able to work through the politics of the era that they were in. And I think there was some sentiment among some of the owners that would be a good thing. Money, greed, greed is a very powerful thing, and sometimes greed is more powerful than racism.
Yeah,
And um, it would have been interesting. So yeah, loading up those teams would be. I mean, can you imagine the heart attack it would have given the Yankee owners? I mean, it just it yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah. The
terrible.
Philadelphia Athletics are coming to town, and
Yeah,
they've got Page on the mound, and
yeah. Now they're good. That's
yeah, that would
great.
have. And so that's something I've always wanted to do, just trying to figure out what set to do that with. Again, to where, and again, not only do you have the historical apples and oranges, you also got the card set, the game set apples and oranges, like we talked about, the 38 replay, they've obviously designed this for that purpose. If you take different sets, you may not get, you know, that same, you know, I know one thing that might be fun is like instead of this be, like taking the 24 um, Monarchs, the Negro or the Diamond Gem set from Strat, and instead of putting them on the A's, make them the A's. You know what I mean?
Sure.
In other words, just get rid of the A's completely, and then let them take their place in the league, and then play it out that way. That would be doable.
Yeah, it would be, and it would also make for a much more interesting pennant race because you'd
Yeah.
club teams more in the middle, so that would be fun too. Yeah, I think I suppose if you were going to do it and you went further back than probably the early 30s or the late 20s, you'd really start to have some problems with logistics. But if you stayed in the 30s or early 40s, you could really get a pretty good glimpse about what earlier integration might have looked like and the impact that might have had. The other nice part is your game sample sizes for your Negro Leagues teams would be bigger.
Hmm.
More research has been done on later teams. Um, so yeah, that would be fun. That would be good stuff. And it would run some of the white players who just frankly weren't very good. It would run them out of the league and raise the quality of play for the country really. And so there's a lot of interesting angles to it.
And that was another thing as I get into Negro League history, is how much of it was Hispanic history as well. It wasn't, even in 1920, a lot of the players, you had the Cuban stars, East and West, but even on the general teams, like I said, Cristobal Torriente, played center field. Um, so they changed teams so much it's hard to remember who is where, but
Right.
but the point is there was a lot of Hispanic players, even going back to the very beginning. So,
Absolutely.
it's not just Negro League. A lot of, Cuban and you know, players too as well. So
Absolutely. No question. And how you looked, played such
that's
like
what it was.
for the Reds was lighter skinned. And so he
Hmm.
passed as a gringo essentially when he wasn't. And so and John McGraw would look at give players tryouts and say, well, you're good enough, but your skin's too dark. I can't get away with, and I would, and we don't really know, I mean, I guess it's a little disingenuous to say to put John McGraw a little bit too far ahead of his time, but um, that was part of the calculation about whether these players could be signed. And so, yeah, there's just so many interesting angles.
Yeah, I would say back then, even coming out and saying they were good enough would have been a risk.
Right,
For people like McGraw and Babe Ruth. I mean, they were a lot of those guys. They unabashedly said these guys are as good as we are, maybe even
right.
better.
Yep.
And so again, it's tough to put yourself again in their time frame and what they were facing. Again, it was just
Yeah.
coming out and saying they were good enough, because that was the myth, the lie, is that,
Right.
well, yeah, we let them play, they just aren't good enough. And so to
Right.
go against the lie and the myth, that would have taken some kahunas, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Different time. It's almost difficult to imagine it now, but it's yeah, when you read about it, it's just phenomenal that the attitudes. But, even for Native Americans, Chief Bender,
Mhm.
um, uh, people looked at Allie Reynolds sort of askance, and
Yeah, even
really,
Babe Ruth. I mean, I
yeah,
think if Babe Ruth wasn't as good as he was,
yeah,
his appearance would have cost him, would have given him some trouble.
right. So
But I
there's
mean, he was
just
just so good.
shades of color mattered. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
crazy, crazy.
Well, again, that's to me, I think that's my fascination with the Negro Leagues, is that these guys just didn't get a chance to see, and again, the two things we know for sure is that when it was integrated, they did very well.
Right,
Obviously, and when they had the opportunity to play against major league competition, then they did very well.
right,
To the point where, Landis wouldn't let them play teams; they could only play all-star teams. Because they were, routinely, just regular major league teams. Now in their defense, quite often the Negro League teams were all-star teams. It wasn't, but still, they showed they were very capable when given the chance. So we do
yep,
know that for sure.
yes. There's enough to know that. Yes.
So, what do you think about the future of this in the game? I mean, again, being able to put these guys on the table. I thought about this the other day, and I'm sure it would probably mean little to these guys. But, I think a lot of them felt like nobody, the history wouldn't care, but at least in some redeeming factor, they are getting notarized now. There's a huge interest in it. I wonder if Oscar Charleston, would ever imagine in 2023, some nerdy white guy was interested in him and had a card representing him. And, at least in some way, that's a redeeming thing. Again, not nearly enough, but still, they may have got some pleasure out of knowing that people are going to care about what they did. I think all of us want that. We all want people to feel like we've done something important and that last. And quite often, they probably didn't felt like that wasn't the case. Uh,
Right.
but the future, I mean, do you see, you know, these companies continuing to improve and continuing to put out products that guys like us who enjoy the Negro Leagues will be able to enjoy? And
Yeah, I do. And I think that for a couple of reasons. Number one is I think that I think the body of research over the next couple of decades is going to be fleshed out. And so it's the work of going through the microfiche and the microfilm is going to be done. And in the next 20 years, we'll probably have as complete a historical record as can be had. And so then after that, the question will be the analytical part, and that is to sort of make some sense in a historical way about what that really tells us about the quality of play and the talent of the players. I will say that I think the next generation of sim player behind us, so I think we'll have a fairer look at the ability of the Negro Leagues players, because I think our generation, my perception is that there's like a built-in bias against the data that is coming out, and there's a built-in bias against the players, because the amount that's known is less than what is known about their white contemporaries. But I think in another generation, that bias is going to be gone, because the statistical record will be pretty much completed. And I think people will be able to take a fairer look at what that looks like. And so whether or not that means that tabletop games are going to be more accurate and therefore more popular because they're reflecting a more finished statistical product, or whether that means that the video games that the next generation is really investing a lot of money into is going to be able to reflect the abilities of those Negro Leagues players in MLB 2047.
Right.
It doesn't really matter, because I think that the players are going to be able to be respected more in a historical sense than they are right now. And I think that's the exciting part. Their legacies matter.
Mm-hmm.
The history of the game matters. And so I think we're in this sort of, there's, our generation still has this, well, yeah, but you know, who did Josh Gibson play against? And that's sort of like, there's a generation of not excuses, but sort of rationalizing. And I really, it really bothers me when I hear that, because these guys are owed better, especially because there's plenty of evidence now that the talent that of the guys that they were playing against is better than anybody really suspected 20 and 30 and 40 and 60 years ago. And so it just kind of, it drives me crazy a little bit, but I do think we're getting to a point, maybe not in my lifetime, but not too long after that, when the statistical record is going to be clear enough that the baseball historians are going to be able to look at these guys and really make sense of where they fall in terms of their talent and their accomplishments relative to the white players of the same era. And I think that's really that is going to be a great day. We're getting there.
Now, do you personally have any, like, for example, and I'm just throwing this out there, if you and Chris White got together and worked on, and I know you have done that some with Chris, right?
Right. Yes.
Do you have any plans on, I know you did some Pine Tar stuff. I don't play Pine Tar myself, nothing against it. I'm just kind of at my max of baseball sims right now.
I can,
you know and so I mean, do you have any plans on working with Chris, for example, or other gamers to try to continue to build sets? Because obviously you have a good working knowledge of it, so I would definitely be most interested in something that you would work out, especially with Chris, because his cards are fantastic, the quality, so.
absolutely does great work. There's no question about it. Chris asked me to develop a list of the greatest teams, single season teams of all time in Negro League's history, and which I did. And he created five different 10 team sets that reflect that. And so there's two pieces to that. They're current. You can get them from Chris right now.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, they are the greatest teams in Negro League's history. But then there are some franchises, like, for example, Memphis, for example, or Birmingham.
Mm-hmm.
Southern Negro League cities generally weren't as talented
Right.
as the northern cities were. And so, Chris, after I said to Chris, well, what about these other cities? They don't really have, much. They don't have any titles. They don't, I mean, they had some seasons where they had decent records. And Chris said, well, take the major cities and choose their best team and card them as well. So then I would do the research on them so that even Memphis and Birmingham and there's a couple teams in Florida who were not real good, but
Right.
the best that they had. And so Chris, I think, put together an amazing set of the greatest teams. He as soon as I identified, which teams would be the best ones, he went ahead and made the card sets. And I love that kind of work. And as far as the single season stuff, that stuff too. I mean, I'm always ready to work with Chris. I've worked with Chris on the Japanese leagues teams as well. And I think that's a huge area that we're going to have to learn about. And if you don't believe that, then people weren't paying attention to the latest WBC. Because the world is changing in
Mm-hmm.
terms of baseball, and so yeah, I'm always ready to work with Chris on projects like that. He's a very, very busy man, and rightfully so.
Now, did you on the greatest team set? Did you help with the ratings, or did you just help? Did you just choose the teams?
I chose the teams and I put the spreadsheets together to basically uh, so that he wouldn't have to card every single player. So if John Smith, who batted once and played in 2 games, uh, I think I cut off the rosters at like the 16 or 17 most used players and then put those on Excel spreadsheets and sent them to Chris.
Because I mean, as we discussed, in order to get the highest quality card set, it would be more than just looking at the stats. It would, like you said, it would take somebody who knows a little bit about the history, knows a little bit about the reputation, knows a little bit about, other players talking about, Oscar Charleston was the best I ever seen, that kind of thing.
Right.
So,
And
so I,
And if you're going to do cross eras, as you kind of were talking about before, if you're going to do cross eras, then that suggests that some normalization probably needs to take place too. Um, and, I don't know, like Chris's process, I don't really know. Like, I know that I know the data that I generated for him because I still have the spreadsheets, but where it goes from there, I don't really know.
okay. Yeah, because I mean, you know, one critique is the 20 set is that nobody has a third 31. And as you know, if you know ABBA at all, the third 31 is usually the guys who are good at hitting and running because the 31 is a single on a hit and run. And so nobody I've been able to see has the third 31. So, I'm guessing that that's probably going mainly off of just the stats that are, and steam heads or whatever. So again, I would be really interested in, something that would kind of help with that and say, okay, here, these guys hit and run a lot, so let's make sure we get that third 31 on, that kind of thing.
Right. No,
So that would take more than just looking at the stats.
right. And the problem with that is that as I experienced when I created the pine tar stuff is that really makes it slow. I mean,
Hmm.
I mean, I bet it took me when I create a pine tar team, it probably takes me about 6 hours or so, seven
Hmm.
hours. And when I was working on those sets, I was spending 15 to 20 per team. And so to do that is it's slow work. I mean, it's definitely better. I totally get what you're saying. You get a much better, a much richer sense of the teams and the players, but it's not quick by any stretch. So
Well,
that's got to be part of
I'm
it too.
perfectly okay. Again, I just don't use the hit and run. And I just imagine that they're hitting and running. Again, a lot of this is fantasy. And
Sure.
you have to work. And so again, it's not bugging me a ton. I just know that I can't hit and run because nobody has that third 31, and so I
Right.
just don't. I just
Yeah.
so I just assume that the guy who went from first to third was because they hit and run. So
Right.
again, this is fantasy, and so again, like we discussed, you have to. This is part of the Negro League. I don't care how detailed you get. There's still going to be some of that involved, and so that's fine. And again, I also understand that you want to return on your investment because things take time, and I don't know, if you spent that much time getting to that level of detail, whether the return on the investment would be worth the time. So I get that as well. But so Pine Tar, you just did greatest teams with them.
Right. I did great teams, and I did uh, franchise all stars because we had created a franchise all star system of carding players for um, the 30 teams that existed in 2018. And that was typically their third best season. Sometimes their second best season, depending upon the franchise, to try and level the playing field a little bit. And so I took the same approach to creating franchise all-star teams for, I believe it was 8, maybe it was 10 of the most famous and most the most games played by the top 8 or 10 franchises, and created franchise all-star teams for those. And I created the great team set, and I think I did a great players set, but I can't remember. I might have. I can't remember.
'Cause if they have, I might have to get into Pine Tar if you got you got some good Negro League options over there. Because again,
Yeah,
I'm always looking for that.
it was, in terms of a learning experience. I mean, it was a joy to make those teams.
Mhm.
It because like there was a reason to do the research. Like a lot
Mhm.
of times when I'm just reading about something, I just end up anywhere, and I'm not, but this had to be a very targeted, very focused stuff I was looking for. And it was so much fun to do. Very time consuming, but so much fun to do. Just, yeah, incredible. But um, I didn't do any individual season. I had thoughts about doing 1934. I think that was the one that I had in mind because I was looking for a season with compelling races and rich enough uh, sample sizes to be able to create cards that I'd feel comfortable with.
Mhm.
And I think I picked out 34. I've got some notes on that somewhere, but I had never finished it.
Yeah. Again, I mean, it's like you would have to take some liberties. I think in most years. Again, because if you tried to do 1920, for example, you've got a lot of teams like Baltimore. I think played 7 games that they have record of. But there
Yeah,
there was a couple good names on those teams that didn't play anywhere else that year. And of course, we know they were barnstorming most of the time, and
sure.
that kind of thing. So I mean, but I think you could probably maybe look at the season before, the season ahead, and get a decent idea of if you wanted to try to do make a team, for the guys that were on this team. Of course, another problem you have is quite often, you'd get somebody from another team that would come play with this team for a while. You know,
Right.
not only did they switch year to year, they switched, week to week quite often, whether they would get more money to go play somewhere else or, and quite often in the early Negro League, as you know, they were trying to make the league work. And so as a result, they would move players. Yeah.
Yep.
Not only the players themselves would do that for the money, but the owner or the team managers would. It'd be like, you know, St. Louis is getting hammered. We're going to send them, turkey's turns, so that they can compete.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
so, but at any rate, I think the research would be fun. And I'm sure whatever you came up with, they'd be complainers. Um,
No,
internet guy, like you say, you know.
yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, if you again, I obviously love your channel and I'm a member. I'm always particularly interested in your Negro League stuff. So if anything that you and Chris, especially if it was to the point where you were responsible for the ratings and you were, getting into the nitty gritty where that you were really making these sets as accurate as you felt like it could be, that would be a lot of, I would be interested in that. Now, whether anybody else would, I don't know.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Um, Actually, about doing some getting serious about doing some creating of some sets, but I haven't. It's difficult. It's difficult right now because there's only so much time,
Hmm.
but I love doing it. There's no question. I mean, I get, it's one of those things where you like after dinner you start working on something and then all of a sudden it's 2 in the morning. I
Right.
mean, it completely lose track of time. It just is wonderful that way. So
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you got to, and again, I could be completely off base. Marketing's not my gift, uh, but I think you
you,
got a big enough following that and there's enough interest in Negro League stuff. I think that they would be interested in that. Especially if Chris would allow you to, put your name on it. I think that I think there could be some interest there. But again, who I could be completely off my rocker. Maybe it could be
well,
just a selfish thing that I would like it.
well, it's worth the conversation. Sure.
All right. Well, that's all the notes I had. Was there anything that you knew what we were going to talk about today? Is there anything that you can think that we didn't touch on that you would like to?
No, I just think I guess the only thing that I would say is that if you are a uh, person who enjoys our hobby and you haven't gotten into or you haven't tried sampled a Negro League set from one or the other Sims, it's just a great time to do it. I just would really encourage people to. If you don't do it, you're really missing out, and you've got a wonderful opportunity now because so many Sims are producing such cool stuff that pretty much no matter which sim you use, you can find something that you can sort of dip your foot into and see what you think, and you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to appreciate the game more. And I just think it's a now 2023 is a great time to do it. And so if you haven't, I would encourage everybody to do that. I think it's a really important part of baseball history. And if you don't know about it, or if you don't know enough about it, uh, now is a great time to start.
No, I agree 100%. It's I've always had a fascination with it. Not sure why. Again, I think it just knowing that there's a real quality baseball
Mm,
that didn't get a chance to do its thing in the big stage. And so, I love baseball history. And so, Lou Gehrig interests me, Babe Ruth interests me, Walter Johnson interests me. And so I know that there's players that were as good as those guys that didn't get a chance. So Oscar Charleston interests me,
mm,
again, because these guys are, top level Hall of Fame
absolutely.
baseball players. And so I don't feel like my baseball experience is complete if I don't, get these guys on my table and watch them play, and whether that's for me, the head-to-head teams when Turkey Stearns is on the same team. I just again that's too too much fantasy. I like your as played, my head explodes. So,
Love it.
it's interesting to me how you have revolutionized our hobby. How many YouTubers quote you? They quote you more than any other YouTuber I know. The authentic unboxing. You know, uh, you know,
Thank you. That
the,
you're fine, but I don't know. But heads do explode. I've seen it happen.
exactly. So for me, I just can't have Turkey Stearns playing against Turkey Stearns. I just can't handle that. So, but again, I appreciate your talking to me. That
Always pleasure.
these chats are more for me than anybody. I'll get interested in something and I'll be like, hey, I want to talk to Kurt about Negro League. That would be enjoyable.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what people say in the comments. Maybe there's other stuff for us to. Maybe there's stuff we've missed that people want us to come back and talk about. So
Yeah. Again, I would certainly be up for that because I know I enjoy these very, very much. So,
great.
all
All
right,
right.
Kurt. Well, I appreciate it very much.
Thank
And
you, my friend.
you,
Have a good one, and congratulations on 1,000 subscribers. I
oh,
should have said that at the start. Nice going.
thanks. Yeah. No, thank you very much. I'm glad
Milestone.
people are enjoying what we're doing here. So,
Absolutely.
all
All
right,
right.
man.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you.